Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Rethinking ATM Security, How to Successfully Integrate Digital, Physical, and Human Risk Management. My name is Austin Lafferty. I'm Director of Marketing at Blackpanda, and I'll be moderating today's discussion, which is joint presented by SentinelOne and Blackpanda. So before we get started, just want to go over a little bit of webinar etiquette for all of our webinars. So first of all, strictly no recording of the session, please. Also, all attendees will have their cameras and switched off and their microphones put on mute just to minimize any noise disruptions during the presentation. Also, if you want to ask any questions, you can raise your questions by putting them in through the Q&A window, which is located at the bottom of your screen. Because following the session, we will do our full Q&A session with the presenters. Also, there is a post-webinar survey. So once you do exit the webinar session, please do fill that out because that helps us to understand what we're doing right and how we can continue to improve and make these sessions as valuable as possible to all of you. So I'm joined today with Kelvin, who is Security Engineering Director over at SentinelOne, as well as Kevin McCaffrey, who is VP of Operations and Revenue at Blackpanda. Before we get started, just to go over a little bit the agenda for today. So first, Kelvin will take us through a little bit around the concept of dwell time and SentinelOne's role in reducing the time to contain these threats. Kevin will then take us through a little bit on the application of the tool in terms of compromise assessments and threat hunting, followed by a real world case study on ATM fraud investigation in APAC that the team worked on together. And then finally, we'll have Kelvin come back and give us a technology demonstration of the SentinelOne platform, followed by a Q&A session with the presenters. Now, one last thing before we get started, just to kind of get everyone engaged a little bit better, we want to do an anonymous poll to get a better idea of how you guys are protecting your ATMs. So if you wouldn't mind, I'll launch the poll now. And remember, this is an anonymous question, so no worries on your answers here. And just give everyone maybe 15, 20 seconds to read through and answer with multiple choice. All right. Let's give it a few more seconds. Let's see some more people adding in votes. All right, I think we've got just about everyone in. Okay, I'll end the poll. So hopefully you all can see the answers here now. And without further ado, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Kelvin to get us started.
So, very good morning. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for participating in this webinar, this event. I think for a start, what I would like to do is to discuss about the concept of dwell time. When we talk about dwell time, there are several definitions. And I think in some of the studies that we have seen, in some of the trends and reports that we have analyzed, what we do notice is that attackers could be residing within your network or dwelling within your network for a good amount of days. Some of the figures that we have seen is up to 94 days, and that's significantly higher compared to the other regions like America and EMEA. Next slide. So if I were to kind of put the definition for dwell time, is basically the length of time that a cyber attacker goes undetected and has free reign of an environment. Now, I do know, I do understand that certain security practitioners will also indicate that the dwell time includes the point where the cyber attacker is identified or detected to the point where it is being remediated or is being resolved. So I just want to focus on this aspect of dwell time being the point where he is undetected, because if we look at another dimension of the attack lifecycle, there will be another concept called the time to contain. Next slide, please. And so time to contain would mean the time where the attacker is being detected to the point where you have done a eradication or remediation or the cessation of that particular attack. Now, in the engagement that we have done together with Blackpanda, this is a screenshot from one of the clients. And we have obfuscated the customer information. But this is an interesting one is because in this particular scenario, the customer was not even aware that there was an attacker dwelling within the environment or within the system itself. So the lack of awareness is one thing. Based on the discussions that we have with them, they have several products within that particular network. And this in particular is the ATM network. And they have solutions like traditional AV monitoring solutions, firewalls, and so on. But it was only until when the SentinelOne platform was installed did we then discover that there were other things that were lurking within that ATM network. So a couple of metrics or a couple of points I'd like to highlight is that this was deployed back in December, and then we detected several of their machines being compromised, and a lot of these executables or these malicious codes were polymorphic in nature. In other words, they mutate and they have different signatures and so on. So when you're relying very much on traditional AVs or signature-based type of solutions, this is where a lot of the bypass or a lot of the attacks actually occurs. Next slide. So another point to highlight is that the machines that they have for their ATMs, they are running Windows 7 machines, Windows 7 operating system. Some of you may be aware, and if you have ATM networks, you would know that Windows 7 is not supported, officially supported today. What is peculiar about the machines here is that I guess when we look at ATM machines, they are not really the high-end type of devices that you see today. This particular one was basically running a Windows 7 32-bit with only 2 gigs of RAM and a 2-core CPU. So typically, this is the kind of platform or hardware that you see that's running the ATM networks. Next slide. So I'm going to dwell a little bit more about the time to contain. And at the point in time when you detect a breach, what is the time that's required for you to regain full control of the affected assets and restore that to a trustworthiness environment or in a state? That is basically what I mean by time to contain. Slightly different from time, dwell time, in a sense that attacker might be in your network and you're not aware about it to the point where you detect him. Then how do you actually bring your system up to a trustworthy state? Next slide. So if I were to kind of dissect the time to contain, is really the point of identification to the point of cleanup. And this is the part that I'm going to focus a little bit more in my next couple of slides. Next slide. So if you think about decomposing this methodology or the methods or the process itself, Saints Institute came up with a nice logical flow from T0 to T contain, thinking about the concept of when you detect a particular threat, how are you going to respond, whether is it going to be automatic, whether you have the tools that provide the automatic response or the manual response, and so on. But in many of the discussions that I have with a lot of organizations and beyond just the ATM network, their IT network or OT network as well, whenever they do detect a threat of some sort, they would tend to isolate or disconnect that particular device from the network. This is the general feedback that I get most of the time, the priority in terms of their incident response action. Many organizations are still stuck in a signature-based type of solution. So what they tend to do is they update the signature, AV signature database and perform a full disk scan on all the devices just to make sure that the other devices are not affected. But if I were to refer back to the case that we mentioned earlier on, when you have a polymorphic kind of malware kind of attack, then chances are is that it's difficult to keep the signature database updated. And you really need another dimension, another method in which you can detect this sort of threats. Points 3, 4, and 5 falls heavily on the responsibility and the shoulders of the IT or the SecOps teams to understand and to handle the incident, restore the backup or the last known good backup. I think many a times when most of the operational team, when they try to restore a backup, they are sometimes not even sure if that backup was really good because of the dwell time, and they're not sure when the attacker has been around. And then, of course, the other tools that you might leverage on to understand the full cycle of the attack tends to also be a challenge, is because in many cases, most organizations rely very much on a SIM or a log management tool, but it's always after the fact, and you can't really tell unless you have very good correlated rules and some intelligence around finding that needle in the haystack. Next slide.
All right. Yeah. So before we hand it over to Kevin, we have one more poll question, sort of more relevant to Kevin's piece. So let me launch that now. And I think users, you guys can answer the question sort of as Kevin goes through as well. I believe you can just minimize the poll when you've finished answering on your own.
Okay, well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I know there's a kind of a global presence here looking at the attendees, so thank you for attending. Next slide, please. As we're talking about cybersecurity across human and physical landscapes, first let me introduce myself. I'm the Vice President of Operations and Revenue for Blackpanda. What our specialty is in compromise assessments and threat hunting. So we partner quite closely with SentinelOne to take a look at people's networks from the inside out. I think all of us understand the value of VAPT and penetration testing, but that's an outside-in type methodology. We take a look from the inside out, and then also across the human and physical integration. Next slide, please. And so that's where we have kind of taken a role where we take a look as our military background, law enforcement background, intelligence background, and take a look and see what's been missed. Because quite often when you take a look at some both closed environments such as the ATM networks, but also corporate security environments, there's a lot of leeway and there's a lot of room to say, where have we not looked? And so it requires that human element to sit behind the hardware and take a deep dive. So one of the things we do in every case is we deploy SentinelOne to get that visibility. So we scale quite quickly across all networks. Specifically to the ATM environment, this is a network that is typically underutilized. There isn't a lot of visibility, especially single source monitoring. So it's quite helpful to kind of see from a larger macro perspective what that network looks like. The next thing we do is we take a look and we do active threat hunting. So in addition to what SentinelOne provides in terms of the kind of passive threat hunting, the collection, aggregation of data, as well as the machine learning and kind of the behavior-based identification of threats, we also do manual queries. So we're looking for the most advanced malware, we're looking for fileless malware, we're looking for polymorphic malware and behaviors to really take a 100% deep dive look across that network. And then lastly, we also do darknet sweeps to kind of pairs with that to see is there any chatter on the darknet? Is there anything that is an indicator that these networks might be at risk? Next slide, please. So why Asia and why APAC? I think APAC is traditionally underserved by the cybersecurity market. But as you can see here from the breakdown of attacks versus 2020 to 2019, Asia is by far and away largely representative and growing quite quickly in terms of the threat and attack velocity. So just behind Europe and not too far behind North America. Yet in terms of cybersecurity maturity, it's quite lagging. And because of that, a lot of the attacks that we see are on, as Kelvin mentioned, legacy networks that perhaps aren't best prepared against the most advanced threats. Next slide, please. So what happened and what is a real world case study that we can learn from? In terms of ATMs, we respond to a variety of incident response fraud investigation cases across APAC. What was curious about this one is our original scope of work. We were hired by a large banking client in APAC to take a look at particular cases of fraud that were happening, originating from ATM points of transaction. What we did to start the investigation, as we do in most of our investigations, is firstly deploy SentinelOne so we can gain visibility across the entire network. And secondly, and quite closely associated with that, was digital forensics of the problem platform. So the exact ATM, the exact machine where the compromise occurred. What that allowed us to do was take a look at, okay, is there something on the machine specifically that's contributed to this? And then also, since we're on site, let's do some interviews across the human risk landscape. So let's talk to the security guards who service that equipment. Let's talk to the actual maintenance company, the manufacturer, and their security team. And then let's also take a look at the cameras and surrounding landscape. What else has possibly contributed to this? As part of that too, we did an operational due diligence into ATM operations. So what is the client themselves seeing in terms of their ops team? And then from their cybersecurity team, how are they communicating to the platform? What type of firewall rules are in place? And also, what are they doing? How are they managing and maintaining the AV and some of the ATM operational software? So what we found was that, first and foremost, closed networks are not secure. I think everybody understands air gaps and closed networks have a higher degree of security, but it's not a perfect solution, and there still are ways to get around that, especially when it comes to third-party vendor risk. So every machine, whether it's an OT environment or ATM environment, requires servicing. And what we found is that not only was the servicing vendor, in this case, not employing their own people, it was a manpower agency, so unvetted individuals that were providing updates to the machine. Quite common, by the way. That's not unusual, and it's no ding on the manufacturer or the vendor. That's just the reality of Asia Pacific business. But also, those technicians were not properly monitored. So when they were on scene, there was no understanding of what they were putting into that machine. And what we saw through digital forensics was there was multiple USB devices. There was even a cell phone connected, none of which were authorized by the manufacturer or by the vendor or by the company itself. So what was on those devices? We still don't know. Also, the physical guards, they're there to kind of look over the shoulder of the technician, but they're not trained. They don't know what they're looking for. They're typically focusing on cache security. So huge vulnerability there. The other part of it was that the ATMs didn't have any anti-malware software. So even if there was a transfer of malicious scripting between those USB devices that we mentioned, there's little to no chance that the existing AV would be able to detect it. In the case of this particular client, there was an ATM monitoring software. So Vynamic, also, Vision is another software that we see quite frequently, but it was not configured to be a robust security tool. Again, not uncommon and no ding on the manufacturer. It's just not what that system is set up to monitor for. So what did we do? We found that, okay, there is a vulnerability. Now we need to see across the whole network, has this spread? Is there something that we can do to find out how the client's been impacted or affected? What we found is that there was indeed a command and control malware embedded underneath legitimate processes in a particular endpoint, and traditional antivirus did not detect that. It's also impossible to blacklist because, as Kelvin said, it was polymorphic. So it continued to change and kind of evolve across the different endpoints in which we discovered it. And then once we understood that, we were able to train SentinelOne to look for that particular behavior, vice file name. So what was that software or that malicious script trying to do? Who was it trying to communicate with? And then we could track it from that point onwards. So from that single point, we were able to track it down to 13 more ATMs, which if we had not had SentinelOne would have been an impossible task. Digital forensic is very time intensive. It takes a long time to collect that information from a single endpoint, and even a longer time to analyze it bit by bit, byte by byte. So once we paired that human investigation with the scalability of the tool, that was the perfect marriage. So we were able to look across the entire network, collect that information, and advise the client on how to best protect themselves going forward, and as well as contain and quarantine that. Now, luckily, it was fairly closed in that the command and control was not able to get out, so it wasn't able to do its intended purpose. But how did it get in there? We strongly suspect it was through perhaps a compromised removable media device, because we saw a large number of them unauthorized, a cell phone, which might have been there for charging purposes, but could have been there for other purposes as well. Next slide, please. So how do we rethink ATM security? I think in any security practice, we always have to assume that we can and will be compromised. So no system is perfect, and even if it's in the most secure environment in the world, if attackers want to find a way, they will find a way. So that's the first piece of advice I would offer, is rethink your understanding of what a closed air gap system might be. That could be an ATM system, that could be a SCADA system if you're in energy, that could be a maritime system, a ship to shore or offshore. Rethink what that closed system is, because invariably there will be avenues to gain access to that system. The second part is operations. What we also noticed with that particular case study is that the ATM operations team didn't talk to the IT team unless they needed to release some ports through the AV device so that they could service it. But other than that, there wasn't a great crosstalk between ATM operations, cyber security, the IT team, and then the physical security, the guards on the ground. So having that kind of holistic approach where you're tying those together is quite critical, because had the guards understood that different devices are not authorized, they would have prevented that. So even at the physical level, that there needs to be some training to kind of better integrate that. Also, the visibility was an issue. So while the ATM operations team did have, as I mentioned, a dynamic monitoring solution, it didn't have security functions enabled. They weren't able to see across their entire network. And especially if it was a fileless or polymorphic malware, they weren't able to actually track it or even see it. So that visibility and that cross-functional integration at a single source is quite critical. And then lastly, I would just say organizational awareness. So from the top on down, the ATMs kind of became a forgotten network. It was legacy architecture. They all knew it needed to be upgraded, but it's a very long and kind of a laborious process, especially when you're talking about large distributed networks over a large geographic area. So that kind of C-suite executive leadership awareness training from the CISO point of view is quite important. Because it is a cash point of cash transactions and can be quite quickly exploited. One last thing I'd say in this particular area is not only just in the malware kind of file level of security, but also physical devices attached to that ATM is something that you should consider. We all think about skimming devices when we're talking about ATMs. So putting a fake device to skim cards, or putting a pin pad cover to collect pins, but rarely do we think about the internals of the ATM, where you're connecting the card reader to the machine via encrypted USB. That's also a point of potential compromise. We did see evidence that perhaps multiple devices had been connected. If one of those devices had a collection capability and had a communication capability, it's all too easy for an attacker to put it in there, leave it in there, and for years that system could be compromised at the hardware level as well. And again, that comes back to that physical security piece, where the guard force and the physical security team understands what are the technical devices internal to the machine that they should be looking for as well. So it's really a holistic solution, but it starts with that visibility, gaining access to the network and seeing what's going on inside. Next slide, please. So I want to kind of throw this out there, because this I think is the greatest vulnerability that we observed on site, and that is kind of your vendor due diligence. Now, this doesn't have to be ATM vendors. Maybe you have a different industry. Maybe you have an OT environment. Maybe you have a different kind of closed network. But what do you do to diligence your vendors? In this case, not only were the vendors not using the appropriate processes they're inserting unauthorized removable media, but also the vendor was subcontracting the manpower, which the customer didn't know and it was not aware of. So this was a third party that was involved. So I would ask you, do you regularly audit and diligence your vendors beyond the procurement stage? So continually, periodically monitor and audit. Very important, and something that if you don't do, I would suggest that you do. Yeah, and just from the results, no, this is common. So I'm not pointing the finger or blaming, but 62% don't, and I would strongly consider that, and really ask the tough questions, not just who are your technicians, but let me see their resumes, let me see their CVs, and let's check them out, because they could be subcontracted and you never know about it. And audit their processes, go on site and look over their shoulder, watch what they do, make sure they're following their corporate policy as well, because they might not be. Okay, next slide. Handing it back over to Kelvin for some of the technology and the demonstration of what we used on site and how it helped us.
All right. Thank you, Kevin. I think there's one more slide to show before my technical demo. But it is interesting that you mentioned about the third party, engaging third party. So does that make them the fourth or the sixth party? Okay, Mina, can you show that slide, one more slide down? Okay, yes. So for the technology demonstration, what I intend to do is that I do not have an ATM network in my environment, but I do have virtual machines to mimic something similar to that. So what I have here is basically virtual machines that are running Windows 7, very lightweight, in terms of the very minimal hardware specification. But I do have an attacker machine, which contains all the different malware and malicious codes and so on. That is the machine on the left that you see. That is not protected by any security product. And that's where I keep all my different collection of malware and so on. What I intend to do is to launch an attack similar to what we have seen in that customer environment, and system being protected by SentinelOne, you'll get to see the results of that. So I think that's basically what I wanted to want to show in the next couple of minutes or so. I think that's the key focus on the presentation, on the demonstration itself. All right, thank you. I will share my screen now. Okay, so the first machine that I have here, this is what I call the malware zoo, because this is where I keep all my different artifacts and the samples that I've got. The one thing I need to disclaimer I'm going to say first is that don't try this at home. I mean, a lot of the content, some of the malware and codes and all that, you could download it from various sources and so on. But if you were to try something like this, make sure that your system is protected by an advanced solution like SentinelOne, not a traditional AV type of solution, and make sure that you have this within the confines of a virtualized environment if you are planning to do any testing of this sort. Okay, so the first thing I'd like to kind of highlight is that as part of my job, I do have sets of samples in which I analyze on a regular basis. So on a weekly basis, I'm given something like close to 70 or 50 odd samples. Now, this is very similar to the attack that we saw at the customer site. Malicious code, it could be a ransomware, it could be a Trojan. In particular, that one was more like a Trojan. But when we look at samples like this, or when you see artifacts like that, how do you actually validate if this is a malicious code, right? So just to give you a proof of verification, or something that you can always check to verify, you can always look at the signature of these files, right? And if you go to a reputation website like VirusTotal, those of you who are familiar with malware analysis, or thinking of doing some code malware analysis kind of thing, VirusTotal is a good portal to go to. You could basically put in the signature of that particular payload and then have a look, when this was discovered, it was like 20 days ago. and about 39 out of 69 vendors have confirmed that this is a malicious code, right? So this is basically a good way to validate the code that you have. I mean, the suspicious package that you see, is this having a bad reputation? Are there vendors out there who have already detected or confirmed that this is a malicious code? So this is a good way to validate that. Now, you have to trust me on this one. The 75 or 74 files that I have here, all these are malicious. I'm not going to go through one by one to validate against VirusTotal, but these are relatively fresh, relatively new in the cyber attack world. And so part of my job is basically to analyze some of these and to look at how some of these codes actually behave, right? So instead of just using one file to attack a system, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use all 74 of them as part of the attack. Something to also highlight is this. Very similar to the polymorphic kind of attack, a signature, for example, could be easily changed and could be easily modified. So if you are relying very much on the signature-based type of solution, if a signature has changed and is not found in the reputation side, if the traditional signature-based solution do not have that as part of the signature database, then what's going to happen is that it will bypass that level of security. So where SentinelOne is different is that we leverage on machine learning and AI to look at all these malicious codes. So think of us like an X-ray machine. We can see the insides of the code. And so we know that this is a zero-day attack or if this is a malicious code of some sort. So what I'm going to do is to share with you some of the techniques that's used to do a rehashing or what we call a mutation, a very simple method that's used. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new folder. And let me just call this the mutated folder. And what I'll do is that I'm very careful about this, not to execute it on my machine here. I will copy all the samples, paste them over here. And I will go to that specific directory to do a mutation process. Now, one of the methods that I like to use is the echo command. So echo allows me to add additional, what we call padding, characters, numbers, and all that after the end of file. Now, to do a mutation for 74 files, it can be a tedious process. So I rather use a for loop. So basically what I'm doing is that I'm saying that for this variable in whatever content of this folder, I'm going to do the echo command. And I'm just going to put some random numbers and letters here. And what this will do is that it will go file by file and do a modification of that. So you can see this takes only a couple of seconds. The date timestamp of the file would have changed. And if I now look at the very first file and look at the properties of this file, you'll notice that the hash value is no longer the file name, is something else. Now, if I were to copy this hash value, go back to the reputation website like a VirusTotal and paste the particular signature, what you'll see is that there will be no matches found. So what I've done in that last couple of seconds is just to create from the original 74 malicious code with a very simple command, do a mutation so that you got now 74 zero-day type of equivalent of that file itself. So that's how you actually do a very simple mutation. There are other tools out there that allows you to do mutation. Some of them actually reduces the size of the file. I've seen some that would actually increase the size of the file by wrapping additional codes around it. So there are different techniques. I'm just sharing with you one of them. Now that I have these two packages, right? One of them is the original and the other one is the mutated version. What I can always do is that the next step is to package this into an encrypted package, right? So I like to use WinRAR, for example, that allows me to add in a package. I'm just going to make this into a password protected zip. the universal password for sample exchange is infected, so I'm just going to use that password. And once I do that, what it's going to do is that it will pack the files protected with the password, is a zip package with a password protection. And let me just add the other one as well, which is the malicious code, or the mutated one. And so effectively what I've done is that I've made two packages, both of them are password protected. And let's now go into the machine that is protected by the SentinelOne agent. So I'm trying to mimic this like an ATM machine. If you look at the specification of this particular VM, this virtualized machine here, is that I have a 1-core CPU with 2 gigs of RAM. I don't think you can find hardware with this specification today. And you'll notice that, we are very low memory and CPU consumption kind of agent. We're kind of residing, monitoring what's happening here. So I have created a target folder where I'm going to put the packages in here. And if you remember in my network diagram, I'm connected through to the network to the other machine, which is the malware zoo that I've got. So what I intend to do now is to copy these 2 packages, these password protected zip files, into the target machine. So be mindful that these are password protected. So in other words, this has been packaged. In order for me to open it, I will then have to use WinRAR and then unzip it, right? So what is key and important about this part of the demonstration is that I will now attempt to extract it in this location. So I'd like you to imagine with me in terms of how the attack actually occurs, right? It could be a thumb drive. Because it is a password protected package, they would think that it is secure and all that. But the minute when the packages are then released, what's going to happen is that you'll then notice that the SentinelOne solution detects the threat. And if I were to go into the folder, you can see that all the 74 packages as it was being unpacked will be quarantined. And that's how we actually reduce that time to contain within, reducing the dwell time from months and days to only a couple of seconds, right? So you might be thinking that, okay, the known malware and all that is something that is known. So maybe the solution is able to pick it up. I'd like to highlight that from an analysis point of view, our agent is the one that's residing at the endpoint, that's doing all the analysis on the machine itself, right? So there's no need for connectivity to the cloud and so on. Let's unpack the mutated one. So remember the mutated version, all 74 of them, because of the echo command, now have a different signature. If you're using a signature-based solution, chances are is that you will get compromised. There's a high chance that you get compromised on that. So let me extract the files here, and let me be quick about entering the password. The packages get unpacked. SentinelOne would detect the threat. Let me just open the folder so that you can see this as quickly as possible. And then what you'll notice is that the packages are being unpacked, and then we would have actually quarantined all those. A couple of things for you to take note is that you might see 1 or 2 files there. And the disclaimer I'm going to say is that in some cases, the mutation may not necessarily make the program work again, or there might be a case whereby there's some other mutation. But from a SentinelOne perspective, we have multiple engines to detect different kinds of threats, right? So the static engine is one of them. The behavioral engine is another. If the user decides to click on that, you'll notice that we have detected this, and then we would actually quarantine that, because in some cases, the attack vector might be a multi-stage or what we call a polymorphic kind of attack. So this is a kind of good example is that I've got 74 samples that are known. Again, if you validate every one of them through a reputation website, you know that this is basically a malicious code. I've demonstrated the fact that you could actually do a mutation. And even after a mutation, if there is the behavioral part that's required, then our engine comes in, and then we are able to detect all these different threats and reduce that dwell time or reduce that time to contain. Again, one of the things that you might notice is that there will be a spike in the CPU when the file is being copied. This is actually more a Windows operating system performance spike. But the minute when we do the quarantine and all that, that happens very quickly in a couple of milliseconds. That's how we're able to contain and quarantine all the files on a Windows 7 machine with a very lightweight specification. So I've come to the end of my demonstration to kind of illustrate to you how this is actually being used. I think you can see the performance impact is very minimal on how we can quickly reduce that time to contain. And in terms of the technology, we are not signature-based. We are leveraging very much on the artificial intelligence machine learning component on both the static and the behavioral AI engine to detect all these kind of zero-day threats, whether it's polymorphic, multi-stage, fileless, or behavioral-based. Thank you for your attention. I've come to the end of my demonstration.
Thanks, Kelvin. Okay, so I think now we'll move on to the Q&A portion of the event. So if you do have any questions, please do put them into the Q&A box down at the bottom of your screen. But one last thing before we move over to the Q&A, just one question for the audience. So if you do want Blackpanda or SentinelOne to reach out to you regarding the comprehensive EDR and services solutions, please do let us know through the poll here. This one will not be anonymous, so we will be able to see who you are when you respond, so that we'll be able to reach out to you accordingly. If nothing else, then I'll go ahead and turn it over to the Q&A. First question. So we've got one. See, it says, is it required or recommended to hire third-party threat hunters with the SentinelOne platform? So maybe, I think, Kevin, this might be a good one for you.
Yeah, in terms of requirement, no. There's no general regulatory requirement that recommends that. What I would say, though, is there is a regulatory requirement, especially when you're talking about financial institutions or any type of regulated entity, to have robust incident response capability. So that means incident response planning, incident response preparedness, and an incident response team either on retainer, standby, or an insured solution. We are incident responders. That's our DNA as well. And so, in fact, this case in particular, this case study, we responded to an incident. And that's actually how we deep dived and got into the compromise assessment, the threat hunting, and kind of the due diligence across operational and policy level. What I would also say, though, is that just because it's not required doesn't mean it's not recommended. We highly recommend that you perform some type of annual, biannual, or periodic compromise assessment. Remember that analogy of penetration testing from the beginning. Everybody understands that penetration testing is required. It is normally mandatory, but that's only one aspect. You're only looking from the outside in. You're looking at your perimeter defenses. What's going on inside, what's going on at the endpoint level, that's equally, if not more important, because most people aren't looking at it, or if they are, they're relying on a solution that may not be capable of handling the most advanced threats. So as Kelvin mentioned, there's always going to be some threats that sneak through, and with a tool like SentinelOne or with folks like Blackpanda doing the active threat hunting, you're not gonna miss anything because we've combined that human and that artificial learning or software element. Good question, though. I get it all the time.
And I think, Kelvin, we've got one that's probably more suited to you. So question, will SentinelOne work with most like other antivirus solutions or legacy systems?
Okay, so the short answer is yes. We do get this a lot. I think this was the same that we got with the engagement that both of us did for the customer. There might be some existing AV or legacy solution that they have. We can coexist or work alongside with them. Reason being is that some customers may already have that in place, but I think the key point I also like to highlight is that we are positioned and very well positioned to replace any AV solution that you've got, right? So we have been certified, we have been verified, and we EPP and the EDR solution combined into a single agent, so we can replace it. But we do have customers who choose to work alongside, so we can coexist and play nice. Yeah.
So a question, maybe more about the ATM fraud case. So
Mm.
based on experience, are all ATM frauds on ATM usually involving some sort of human factor, or is it possible to send malware remotely?
Ooh, good question. It depends. So some networks are truly closed. So we deal with another customer separate from this event that has a truly closed system. So there is nothing coming in or out. In that case, it's very unlikely that something's coming into the network other than through kind of a physical or logical introduction. But there are other kind of hybrid networks where there are touch points, there are gateways. And in that case, yes, it could be introduced via other methods, could come in through traditional attack vectors. And don't forget that human component also includes the folks that have their corporate networks tied to their ATM networks. So if there's an email campaign and then that malware is distributed that way, it's possible to enter that. So I would say it depends. You'd have to look at each network on a case-by-case basis to see what the infrastructure looks like.
Yeah, I think I'll add to what Kevin has mentioned is all about connectivity, right? If the machines or devices are interconnected, then there's always a chance for that lateral movement of the malware from one point to the other. I remember the first time when I started in this industry, and the first time a machine got infected, it's always through a floppy disk, right? A user moving one floppy disk to another, and that's how infection actually started. But the minute when you have connectivity, that's where there's always a chance that malware could be sent remotely or could infect other systems. And that's where the collateral damage comes in.
Awesome. And then I guess this is a good one for maybe both of you. So in your opinions, why is it that you think that dwell time is so much higher in Asia as compared to some of the other regions?
Maybe I'll take this from the business operations standpoint. My experience, and we worked with hundreds of clients, Fortune 500, small to medium enterprise, all sizes, all industries across APAC, is that I think up until last year, when unfortunately coronavirus hit us all and we all became aware of the impact of cybersecurity, Asia was really lacking in threat awareness. Not that people didn't read the news and they didn't get intel feeds. It's just they didn't think it's going to happen to me, and if not, nobody's going to pay attention to it. Meaning, I can sweep it under the rug and we'll pay off whatever we need to pay off, and that'll be that. The problem is the reality of what's happening since 2019 or 2020 into 2021 is that now it's visible and everybody can see it. And so I think Asian-based businesses are caught kind of on their back heels, where they didn't think they'd have 5 years to build up and get that maturity. It's happened almost overnight. So that's what I've seen at kind of like the business leadership level. Kelvin, maybe from a technical perspective, you can address dwell time.
Yeah, I mean, I echo the same thoughts as you, but the other aspect of it is that on the technical front, we have seen the sophistication of attacks far more complex than before. And I'm not talking about the typical kind of ransomwares that we see. And to your point, right? I mean, if you get ransomware, you always made a decision whether you want to pay or not pay and then just restore. And do you have to disclose that depending on regulatory requirements and so on? So like you said, things get swept under the rug and all that. So the dwell time may or may not be very long in that perspective, because the target, the way the attack actually occurs is really kind of a ransom. They're targeting your systems and so on. But when we move into a more advanced attack like Trojans, for example, when you get Trojans attacked, they're very stealthy in nature. We know that the banks, several of the banks were hit back in 2017, 18, 19, the last couple of years. These goes undetected if you do not have a sophisticated tool, or if you're still relying very much on the traditional or legacy type of solutions, then those go under the radar, and then that's the reason why the dwell time becomes a bit longer in that aspect. If we take that the client that we were involved in, they didn't realize that things were in there until the right tools were being deployed, and that's where we basically see everything all lit up like a Christmas tree, right?
Yeah, I think you made a good point there too about maybe like just the not being visible enough in terms of maybe like the regulatory differences in the region, right? I think, Kevin, when you were talking about your chart, like a lot of people might think of these types of issues as being more of an American problem or being more of a European problem, but obviously like it's on the rise here, and regulation is also catching up to hopefully make that a more visible problem as well.
The sad reality is, disparate to the size and the kind of both economic and physical size of the country, some of the most attacked countries in the world are here in Asia.
No, for sure. I think so. That seems to be all the questions from the audience right now. Maybe if you guys want to leave any sort of parting thoughts on or in summary of today's discussion, I'll leave it up to you guys. Maybe if Kelvin, if you want to start.
Okay, so I think the only last parting thoughts I would say is that from a SentinelOne perspective, I have been in several discussions with our threat researchers, and we constantly publish a lot of articles and the techniques or the tactics that we have seen that's out there. So if you do go to our website, to our blog, you will see some of the more recent articles that have been published. I think quite recently we published one about some of the tools that the hackers are using, and just more from an awareness perspective. I think that's a good point to look at and to explore. The attacks that we see are getting more sophisticated, but having said that, there are also a lot of I would say attack as a service or ransomware as a service tools out there, which the script kiddies and all that could actually leverage. And in many of these cases, I mean, they may not be sophisticated, but they become very destructive. So if you're relying very much on your legacy or traditional way of protection, there's always a risk. And it's not a matter of if you get attacked, but it's when, right? So it's always better to be on the safe side. Understand the strategy that you have. It is not just a tool, it's not just a product, you know, the people, process as well. Everything all falls into play, different cogs, to make sure that your overall security strategy is in place. And it's yeah. Kevin, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, we could talk about for hours on this. I think I'd leave with 3 main points, and the first is visibility. You've got to have visibility to know what the issues are. So that means going through an auditing or a kind of a hygiene check to understand what's on your networks, especially when you're talking about things that are assumedly safe because they're either old or they're closed. They're probably not, and they probably need to be addressed. So visibility. The second one I would say is integration. We tend to look at things in silos. Everybody's at fault. You know, we keep IT with IT, we keep operations with operations, we keep security with security, and rarely do they crosstalk unless there's a crisis. And by the time it's a crisis, it's too late. So I would look at integrating and having that discussion early at your leadership level or at the business unit level. How do we all crosstalk so that these are joint efforts? And the last piece I would say is the human factor, right? That is the X factor in everything to do with cybersecurity. Is what are your human beings doing? Your employees, your vendors. So to counter that, you need to have a well-educated and a well-trained team operating your tools that you're using for those first 2 aspects. So that's where, you know, I'll put on my Blackpanda hat here. That's where we work quite nicely with SentinelOne, because SentinelOne gives us that visibility, gives us that ultimately scalable platform, which has kind of the most advanced threat detection. But there's a human being, there's a Blackpanda operator sitting there and actually navigating and physically querying those different threats. So if you stick to those 3 principles, you know, visibility, integration, and the human factor, both on the threat side and the protection side, I think you're going to be well ahead of the game.
Great. Thanks, guys. So thank you both for your time today, and thank you everyone for joining us. Please do come back to more of our webinars. We'll be sure to be pushing those out via email and on social. So please follow us on LinkedIn. And then following the webinar, when you close out, there will be a survey. So please do, if you have the time, fill that out for us to help us to continue to improve these sessions. Anyway, without further ado, thank you, and everyone have a nice day.